I had my suspicions about Zoetrope, but it was not until this day that I knew it was Don Paramount behind everything.
Hello and welcome back to this downful idealistic crusade. This will be a different type of Blu-ray or UHD review than what I usually do. Normally I talk about the film, my own thoughts on it, I do bits of film analysis. I like to think of it as just everything I can contribute to the experience of the film for both newcomers and longtime fans alike. But this is a bit different. This is a special case. This is one where I feel I have to draw a line somewhere and put my foot down because what Paramount has done with their treatment and handling of the Godfather Trilogy for this 50th anniversary new release and master and quote restoration, and I do say quote in quotation marks because this represents a new sort of standard in what we're going to have to look at in terms of revisionism in the 4K realm and HDR, in terms of what's available in the digital toolbox and what, unfortunately, some rights holders and people in charge are going to think that they can thus do to classic works of cinematic art now that they have this ability to do so and supposedly cater to a modern audience. I have to say I have extreme misgivings about this process, what's been done to the films, and this release on both 4K UHD and Blu-ray is an understatement. If you saw my video where I went through what I thought were some of the worst releases on physical media of 2022, I had to fight the urge to nominate and award every single category award with The Godfather on 4K UHD and Blu-ray because it is that atrocious. Paramount is no stranger to having people who actually know about films and know about physical media and know what they're talking about, criticizing their recent work since really opening their catalog division for the first time in years. And they've been doing such a slipshod, all over the place job of it that it sort of begs the question, why are they doing this in the first place if they're not going to do it right? Because so many of their releases have been plagued by random applications of DNR, terrible encodes. Sometimes they do play around with the HDR a bit, as what you see here in the Godfather Trilogy. Others seem to escape almost unscathed. Others have their opticals messed around with and their fades messed around with. Every special effects shot in the Indiana Jones trilogy was changed or altered for the UHD release. There's no respect for original audio, and there's no seeming respect for the original theatrical presentation of a lot of the catalog releases coming out of Paramount. So no one really knows what's going on over there, but they are without doubt the worst of all studio labels currently doing so-called restorations and making physical media releases. It really hurts all the more because so many others are actually putting in the time and effort. And it seems certain people at Paramount are putting in the time and effort. And there is good work being done, but it is being ruined by somewhere along the line in the chain that there are, I guess, sort of new house standards for changing films and using DNR applications at seemingly at random and ruining new masters. This really, I think, sort of there was like a red flag when their release of To Catch a Thief happened, and that is an appalling treatment of a VistaVision title, and that was of course the film that Robert Burks won his cinematography Oscar for, which he deserved many times over. And it's a Hitchcock title, and it's VistaVision, and yet they produced an ungodly looking disc that everyone across the board said was terrible, and their response was simply not much of a response at all, and basically to say that it was fine and that they restored it. That was not a good sign, and things have only progressed worse until this past year when we got things like Planes, Trains, and Automobiles and many other titles with problems, and titles with problems that they licensed out to other people that they didn't even release themselves. But here it's The Godfather. And as I say in their little restoration piece that really grinds my gears very badly because they seem so proud of the work that they've done, and I don't understand why, because there was good work done. There was more additional original material salvaged and scanned that was not able to be done in 2007, but the work is entirely negated by the fact that they destroyed it with the processing that they did, and it's not just what most people focused on, which was the revisionist color grading, which is a particular problem and one that has been discussed quite a lot all over the internet. While on the surface, this could be a lot worse and it doesn't look as bad as it really is, part of the reason why I this really infuriated me and why I think it is the worst release of 2022 and an appalling treatment of the whole trilogy is a lot of this stuff is sneaky and underhanded, and I'm really just about the only person who's gone on record talking about this as a particular issue. Now, I understand the notion of a lot of people would not call themselves videophiles. They're not experienced in film presentations and haven't worked in a theater, and they don't have a lot of technical background, and they don't have the greatest equipment in the world. That's understandable. But when you get to actual official reviewers who should know these things, and this has gotten nothing but glowing and positive and rave reviews everywhere, then I really can't understand why that has happened. Because other than the fact that a lot of this stuff that has been done is more on the sneaky and underhanded side, it's not as immediately obvious. It's also hard to try and capture in screen cap form. I will be including screen caps of the 1080p SDR version of the 50th anniversary as part of the Trilogy Blu-ray set, because I also purchased that to try it in SDR to see if it was any better than the terrible UHD presentations, and it really isn't, and it has its own problems. What the main problems are here in The Godfather, and this goes for all three films, but they're not the same in how they're treated, because again, this is, like I said, it seems like a lot of stuff is very sneaky and underhanded. Part 1, the original film, is the one that's been given the worst treatment. Part 3 fares the best, and Part 2 is pretty bad, but not quite as bad as 1, but it's still worse than Part 3. And I think that might have something to do with this partnership, because this was a joint venture between American Zoetrope, with Coppola's signing off on it, and Paramount. Paramount wanted to do something for the anniversary. Zoetrope decided to jump in now that their sort of video and restoration department is more up and running after things like doing the final cut of Apocalypse Now and the UHD release and such. So this kind of goes part and parcel with what they wanted to do. And then, of course, this was done also during the pandemic, which meant a lot more hurdles to be overcome, and working from home and different things, like a lot of restorations had to do during the pandemic and during lockdowns. But it's hard to point the finger and try and figure out who exactly did what. And it seems like Zoetrope did the cleanup work in terms of taking the scans that were done and doing the cleanup work in-house, and then they took their cleaned up scans on drives, reel by reel, to be done in terms of doing the color timing and various other mastering at Warner's MPI, Motion Picture Imaging, which is pretty much the premier institution for doing such work. And then once that was done, it got handed over to Paramount. So my guess would be it's when we get to the Paramount sort of area of the equation where all the really nasty stuff popped up in terms of what we see in a lot of other Paramount releases, which do pop up here. But that means you have three entities involved in this process: Zoetrope, MPI, and Paramount. So it's hard exactly to say who did what and where and how this stuff happened. But Part 3 fares the best in terms of the three films. It has the least of these problems. There are still some of them in there, which is unfortunate, but I think this is all because Part 3 was done mostly by Zoetrope, because they were doing the new cut of the film, the so-called The Godfather Part III, Coda, The Death of Michael Corleone, which was Coppola's original intended title that he wasn't allowed to use back in 1990. And like the final cut of Apocalypse Now, Coppola likes to go and make another cut, and that gets him excited about the film again, which is a perfectly fine creative creative process, so long as you don't supplant the original and erase it from existence, like certain other people have done. So that was the real focus in terms of having something new for the anniversary, and they released that first on a standalone Blu-ray. So I think that's probably why Part 3 fares much better than 1 and 2, because it was handled more directly by Zoetrope, but it does seem like Paramount still got in there because it has some of the same problems, but to a much, much lesser degree. So out of the whole trilogy, Part 3 is the only one that won't make a diehard film fanatic with technical knowledge put their head through the wall. But then you go back to Part 2 and it's really bad. But the original film is where the real problem is. I mean, Part 2 is terrible, but the original film is it's been treated quite abominably. And the main problems to talk about why this has me so incensed. Again, the main focus has been everywhere on the color. And this has really been ever since the first glimpses of this new master came out. And it was so radically different to the 2007 version, the restoration that Paramount and Zoetrope claim that was their guiding inspiration and they based all their work off of. Well, I mean, they did have to, because the 2007 restoration did a lot of the groundwork. But then it seems very clearly that after a certain point, they just decided to go their own way and do something completely different, which is what they did, particularly in the color. And despite their claims of using the 2007 version as their reference, which is what Robert Harris restored with Coppola's participation and Gordon Willis's participation, and him signing off on the look and the color timing of the films, which are very iconic and important to the so-called Godfather look. When Robert Harris finally got the new UHD, he wrote one of his usual home theater forum reviews and was very sort of maybe a little cagey, a little hesitant to really get into it, but essentially he was not a happy camper and said in no uncertain terms that this new version was a new version and it was not the films that he restored in 2007, and it was not what Gordon Willis approved of or signed off on or wanted, that this was a new modernized color grading approach. It was a new modern look for all three films, really designed to be fully optimized for modern displays of 2022 and 2023, what we have in the 4K realm. And that gets into the sort of idea that a lot of people seem to be shooting for nowadays of they just want the images to quote unquote pop on a 4K display, whether it's a 4K LED or a 4K OLED or 4K projection. They just want it to really take full advantage of the enhanced color space and the enhancements of high dynamic range, and thus get that sort of wow pop factor. So a lot of people honed in on this argument, and then that started debates back and forth, and the release actually came out. People started seeing it, and it sort of went back and forth. But it is rather plainly obvious that the color approach has been altered. It is a much more naturalized approach to the color. And being someone who hadn't been able to fully upgrade to 4K yet, I just kept up with all this stuff and knew that I would be getting into 4K soon. But I would wait until I could actually view the UHD myself and Dolby Vision. And once I got all my setup worked out and got everything calibrated and got used to watching 4K UHD titles at home. So this meant when I went in expecting the difference in the approach to the color timing, and I thought that was going to be about it, given the fact that it had received nothing but rave reviews everywhere else. What I did not expect are the other massive, major, glaring problems throughout, particularly in the original film and Part 2, but the original film most of all, that go far beyond the issues with the color timing. In fact, these other issues are so bad that I even kind of forgot about the alterations to the color timing. And those are, of course, the atrocious frozen grain that is in all three films, but particularly parts 1 and 2, the pixelization and noise and artifacting that is rampant, the seemingly random application of digital noise reduction to the point of it's on random shots of individual scenes, but not on others. It's on random parts of individual frames and not others. It seems totally random. On top of that, the HDR grading is revisionist and tries to well, I don't know if they were even considering what they were doing, but it does alter the actual the actual lighting composition of individual shots. It is not the same presentation. So this goes far beyond choosing a more modernized look for the film in terms of going for a different approach in the color timing. That's why I use the idea that this is really a sort of new era in terms of revisionism to have to worry about in terms of classic catalog film titles in the 4K realm. This is because we're still pretty early into UHD. This is really reminding me of a lot of stuff from the early days of DVD and the early days of the HD formats, HD, DVD, and Blu-ray, where things were greeted with rave reviews at first because they looked so amazing. And once people saw how good the format could be a couple years down the road and they got better displays, and they could start to see the seams pop out and they could see the flaws become really apparent with a lot of early digital tools that were being used in the early days of DVD and then the early days of HD. Specifically, I'm thinking of things like the awful Lowry Digital approach, especially in the DVD era, and that lasted into HD and unfortunately still curses a lot of films stuck that way, where they would go in and remove grain like mad with massive amounts of DNR, sometimes applying a grain plate after the fact to try and cover it up. And titles that were greeted with unanimous praise at first, a couple years down the road, were seen as the travesties they were. These are titles like, of course, the infamous, horrible Citizen Kane treatment on DVD, which is so bad that it infamously erased raindrops outside Bernstein's window in the office scene. Then of course the early DNR fests in Blu-ray, like the atrocious treatment of Patton or Predator, or probably worst for me, the treatment of Spartacus, which had been saved and restored by Robert Harris and Jim Katz in 1991. And it took years for that to be corrected, for example, for the eventual first the Blu-ray release and then the 4K UHD release, which was an upgrade over the previous Blu-ray upgrade, and Robert Harris was consulted and able to assist on that. Same thing happened on My Fair Lady, where there was a terrible first Blu-ray, and then for the second Blu-ray and then the UHD, that meant 2 additional upgrades with Robert Harris's involvement. So those releases of My Fair Lady and Spartacus are as good as they can be now. That's what we should be seeing here on The Godfather, and we're just not, because of someone's decision to go in and just have a revisionist field day, particularly with the first 2 films, more than Part 3, but Part 3 has some of it as well. So to dig into these problems a bit more, my comments on all of these apply to all 3 films, but again, the original film is the one that suffers the most. Part 2 is just a little bit better, and a lot of these issues are much more subtle. They're not as glaringly in your face throughout the entire feature, but they are still there. Part 3 suffers from them rather little. They're still there to a certain extent, but they seem to only pop up in a few spots here and there. And again, I think that's because that was handled more by Zoetrope, and the focus was on making the new cut entitled Coda. So again, the problems are in all 3 films. The color revisionism is in all 3 films. So that is something you will have to deal with, and thus, no matter what they claim, they no longer resemble the intended look and feel of the films. But as I'm going to get into, the other problems I think even outweigh that. So I stopped even thinking about the color revisionism. It's only when I'm trying to compile all my thoughts and try not to go off the deep end that I have to then also reference the changes to the actual color timing. And again, that's been the only discussion so far in most every place. I've not seen anyone get into the other problems outside of myself and trying to ask other people if they're seeing this too. So first to discuss, I guess we'll jump in with, there is quite a bit of noise and pixelization, macroblocking, all kinds of bits of artifacting that you're going to see pop up, particularly in parts 1 and 2, that just all over the place, and it shouldn't be there. Yeah, I think the key example is in the original film. If you look at the scene when Michael goes to the hospital to visit his father and finds that all the guards have been removed and it's the setup for the next potential assassination, all the shots, particularly of the empty hallways and the iconic and momentous building suspense, well, it's plainly obvious, particularly when you're watching in 4K on an OLED panel, you're going to see noise everywhere in the light fixtures, in the walls, in the ceilings, in the floors, in the shadows. And this runs throughout the film, particularly in all the shadow detail, which seems really odd compared to how it's always been beforehand. And for a film famous for its shadows and its faces obscured in shadow, that's not a good thing. But I noticed it most in that one particular scene. So I encourage people to go and look at the hospital scene in particular and all of the shots of the empty corridors. If you literally pause on those, you don't even have to see it in motion. You can literally pause on those, and you don't even have to look very closely because you're going to start to see all kinds of noise and artifacting there that should not be there. This is only magnified and enhanced by it being in 4K and having a Dolby Vision grading. You can watch the films without Dolby Vision in HDR10, for example, but that actually makes them worse because it doesn't handle it as well. So that this is one of those where you definitely do need to see it in Dolby Vision because it does try and tame that down a little bit. So if you don't have the ability to see this in Dolby Vision, it's going to be even worse. This problem still exists in Part 2, but like I said, like all of these problems to a much lesser degree. In Part 2, you'll notice it most again in the light fixtures, particularly a lot of the single exposed bulbs in the flashback sequences. Anytime there's a lamp or an exposed bulb, or it's a dim scene, even the iconic killing of Finucci with the flickering bulb. Well, there's a close-up of a bulb there, and you see all this noise in the bulb. It's like, well, that shouldn't be there. That's really unfortunate. But you'll see it again in the shadows. And another thing that you'll start to notice, this kind of goes into, I guess I'll talk about the DNR usage now. The DNR application here, digital noise reduction, seems to be almost sort of randomized. It's there in Part 2, but in the original film, it's much worse, and it will be used in individual shots as part of a sequence, particularly in the opening, in the wedding, when Michael and Kay are having their iconic table conversation, and every time it cuts back to Diane Keaton as Kay, there's frequent usage of DNR, but yet on the reverse shots of Al Pacino's Michael, there's not really the same application. And so that causes a sort of weird juxtaposition that's non-intentional, that also with the color timing changes make that seem very odd all of a sudden. But in going through, this is not just a simple DNR scrubbing like what most people might think of, which results in what is usually termed the wax faces, where people look like they're made of wax and they're wax figures because they have no fine facial detail anymore in close-ups. It's usually the sort of dead giveaway that something has been DNR'd to death and all the film grain has been taken out. But here, because it's so selective and it's not in every shot, and then in some shots, it's only in portions of the shot, which is rather bizarre. There's one particularly bad one actually in Part 3, and one of just about, one of the emotional highlights of the film when Michael has the emotional breakdown in front of a casket. The entire half of the shot of the casket is DNR to hell and back, but Michael is not. So you get this really bizarre effect of, you have Al Pacino there in this really emotional centerpiece moment of Part 3. It's one of the best moments in Part 3, one of the only really great moments in Part 3. But, it looks like he's having this emotional, intimate moment next to a sort of blob because it's been denoised and degrained and stuff, and it no longer matches, so it looks almost like it's now an optical shot, and he's been matted in there because they don't match. That one was just unbelievably bizarre. That was like taking the random DNR on a shot in Part 1 and taking it to the stratosphere, because like you could almost draw a line down the center of the frame. But another thing is, it seems like they've tried to go in and actually get at the actual layers of the image and they attempt to remove what is noise and considered, I guess, by some technically a bad thing. The things you'll see in the 2007 restoration on the 2008 Coppola restoration Blu-rays, for example. Well, in doing that, they've altered the texture of the film itself. This is getting into more almost sort of tactile areas, and it's hard to describe because we are talking about visuals, but by getting into the actual image structure itself and mucking about in there, there's now a sort of flatness in the image too, which is truly bizarre. So again, this is getting into sort of territory we haven't seen quite before, and stuff that wouldn't have really been possible 5 or 10 years ago. And, you know, for all the modern tools and fun you can have with HDR, when you start doing stuff like this, you know, it's like, why would anybody think this is a good idea to take it upon themselves to actually get into the image structure of the film itself? So while on the surface it may look technically better than what came before, if you take any bit of a closer look at it, you're going to start to see that there's some definite weirdness going on. And then we come to the thing that really galled me. This is what I found completely unforgivable, and that is the massive amount of frozen green throughout the trilogy. Again, Part 3 doesn't really have any, maybe a spot or two, but it's there in Part 2. It's much harder to spot because this is a famously dark film, of course, and it's not done as much, but it is there. But it is throughout the entirety of the original film. It is unforgivably bad. It's in practically every iconic scene. It's right there in the opening. And if you look at all closely, particularly on the UHD, where it's plain as day, when Brando moves, you see this thick layer of frozen grain and noise around his whole person. It is there. It moves with him. This problem runs throughout the entire film. It's in practically every iconic scene. Again, when Brando, as Don Vito Corleone at the meeting of the five families, when he goes to sit down in the chair, and throughout that entire iconic scene, if you're a videophile, or you know this film like the back of your hand, or you know anything about film, you're not going to be able to take your eyes off the thick halo of frozen grain and noise that is entirely around his person and moves with him. It's even there in the iconic killing of Polygato, of leave the gun, take the cannoli. Because if you look at the wheat that is blowing in the wind behind the car, the actual stalks of the wheat itself is covered in a layer of frozen grain that moves with it. Now that one, you know, admittedly, you do have to kind of squint a little bit because it's, you know, not the focus of the shot and it's in the background. But, you know, it is an iconic image and it is visible. I don't know how people didn't spot this who are official reviewers, and this should be the first thing they talk about because it is in your face and it is there. But because you do have to follow the movement, and because it's not something as immediately obvious as a huge DNR pass where everybody has the wax faces, or the sort of stuff that people are used to that is very apparent to anyone. Basically, I can understand why the average consumer or viewer is not going to see something like this. But a reviewer should. And a professional should. And how anyone gave this a positive review, I will never know. This is simply put unacceptable. And it's not just in one scene. It's not just in the start of the film. It is throughout the entirety of The Godfather. I mean, there are so many films now that are getting scans and releases done by boutique labels and things of all kinds of genre films and things that would be, looked down upon by people, and quite frankly, films that are just plain terrible. And that's the sort of appeal to them, is that they are terrible. Those are getting 4K scans from negatives and getting handled properly and presented on physical media releases and even streaming properly. They have better transfers of schlock than now what we have with The Godfather, because of what has been done on the back end, because people decided they could do whatever they apparently wanted to. So the frozen grain is where I really draw the line. I mean, it is glaringly obvious. It's there also in part 2. It's not quite as prevalent, and it's not all over the place like it is in part 1. So I could see people maybe not seeing it or missing it in part 2, just like the bits of noise and things are much more subtle in part 2, and there you really do basically I saw what had been done to part 1, and so I was just sort of like primed for like, oh no, how bad is part 2 going to be? So I was at least somewhat relieved that part 2 was not quite as bad. But to have any of this stuff pop up in any of the Godfather films, even for a frame or a shot, is just, why? It's just unfathomable. And that it's sort of sneaky and underhanded, and it's not obvious in terms of what most people are going to see, and the fact that they're promoting this as a great restoration and acting like it's such a great thing to have people celebrate for the anniversary of the film really just sticks in my craw and just grinds my gears and really gets me hot and bothered, essentially. I don't often get vocal when I watch a film or I'm watching a physical media release. It takes a lot for me to to actually start reacting to problems. But as I was watching through part 1, I just couldn't believe what I was seeing. And then I started biting my fists like I was Sonny Corleone, and then as it got worse and worse and worse, I'm like, son of a bitch. So I find it unfathomable that anyone gave this a positive review who actually knows what they're doing, because the frozen grain, particularly in part 1, is unforgivably bad. Now, I said part 2 doesn't suffer from these problems as much as the original film, which is true. And because this stuff is going to be considered much more subtle for the average viewer or consumer, a lot of people are going to be scratching their heads and wondering what I'm talking about. So that's why I'm going to include all of my viewing notes that I took for all 3 films with timestamps in the description. And I'm also mentioning specific moments for you to be able to go and look on your own setup and see if any of this starts to become apparent to you or jump out a bit. So that way you can see for yourself and make your own judgment. But ironically, probably the worst looking shot in all 3 films is actually in part 2, when Frankie Pentangeli has his meeting with Tom Hagen at the prison, and they're outside smoking cigars, and it's the really intimate, very important, pivotal conversation between the two of them. And they're in front of the chain link fences, sort of walking around under guard, being watched. I don't know what on earth happened, but that whole sequence, that little sequence, looks like it's been completely degrained. It looks atrocious. It's got noise that shouldn't be there. It looks like it's been DNR'd to death. And I've even heard others because I've asked around just trying to see if anyone else was seeing what I was seeing, and I have heard from others, and even some who saw these as DCPs theatrically, that especially seeing it in a theater, that one shot really stuck out, and they remembered that in particular as looking atrociously bad. So that is the single worst looking shot in all three films on the new master in UHD. I don't know what happened there. So while Godfather Part 2 does not fare as bad as Part 1, it's still really, really rough in spots. And that one spot in particular is probably the worst looking moment in all three films in this new presentation. So that may be like the sort of poster child for the revisionism and tomfoolery courtesy of Paramount and Co. In terms of what they've done to the Godfather trilogy. I just found that ironic that the worst looking shot is actually in Part 2 and not Part 1. Another thing that I found really problematic was that even the subtitles are not they've been redone, but they didn't match the font exactly. So the font is a little bit different than what was in the 2007 restoration, which rather painstakingly tried to get the exact font just right. But if that wasn't problematic enough, the font of all the subtitles have noise and aliasing in them. And it is very noticeable, even when you're sitting back, pretty far. If you know what aliasing looks like, or you see noise on text, you're going to see it on all the subtitles in all three films. And this was not there in the 2008 Blu-rays either. So not only is the font not fully accurate, but they're all the subtitles have noise in them now, which I just found bizarre. But then we come to the HDR grading and the application of high dynamic range and how that was done with the Godfather films. And this starts to get back towards the color timing discussion, because this goes hand in hand with their new sort of modernized approach, because this is very much trying to get that sort of, we want this image to pop on a 4K screen. That's what they seem to have been going for with this. And what's been done with the HDR is readily apparent from the opening of Part 1 when we're in the iconic dark office during the wedding. Because as soon as the blinds are opened more, and when Brando walks over to the blinds, it's like someone is standing outside all of a sudden with a giant light cannon, shining this intensive bright white light into the room, and you feel like you need to put sunglasses on. It's not supposed to be that way. And that really is sort of indicative of how the HDR was done here, because it frequently and seems to always want to be this harsh white light, this very bright, this very direct, bright light, this very, with a very harsh white color temperature throughout. It's all throughout Part 1, and it really is not the sort of color texture, and it's definitely not the lighting texture that was originally shot and composed for. It's there in Part 2 as well, but nowhere near as much. Again, Part 2 suffers from all these problems so much less than Part 1, but they are still there, and you will see it pop up. So if you noticed it in Part 1, you are going to see it in Part 2, but to a much lesser degree, and that goes with all of the issues I'm talking about. They're there in Part 2. You're going to see them if you're really looking for them. And, if you notice things like these, and if you are a videophile, and if you are a film fanatic, and who has a knowledge of what film is supposed to look and feel like, and especially if you've ever seen prints of the Godfather films, or you've had actual experience in projecting them, or, and even to a small degree, if you have a long history with the previous video releases, which, older formats and releases are not ever going to be the most accurate thing in the world. But before this point, they couldn't play around with things to the degree that they have in this master. So even if you know how the films have looked on video in the past, you do have at least a general basic idea of the sort of feel of how they look. Of course, that's with the format limitations of the time and things like that. And to be honest, the older releases were not always, well, not really the greatest ever in terms of the VHS tapes and the Laserdiscs and the first couple DVDs and things. They all had their own problems, but they didn't have anything like this. So this again, we're in a whole new realm of territory, and I think 5 or 10 years from now, people are going to look back and be able to much more clearly see and articulate what's going on here. I know I certainly will most likely be able to, because I think this is going to be an ever-increasing problem, and Paramount seems fully committed to this kind of tomfoolery in most of their releases. So what this means in conjunction with the new modernized approach to the color grading is visually this isn't quite the Godfather anymore. It doesn't have the famous Godfather look that everyone talks about. And for all of their talk and saying, oh, well, we have reverence for Gordon Willis's wishes, and we were following his signed-off master on the 2007 master. That was our basis for everything, and da-da-da-da-da-da-da, and we wanted to acquiesce to his wishes, and he's no longer with us. Well, I can tell you one thing. I'm damn sure that if Gordon Willis were around... I think it would be a situation like what Owen Roizman did when William Friedkin did the awful first master of the French Connection for Blu-ray and publicly blasted it, and that caused that to thankfully be recalled and replaced by the Director's Series replacement Blu-ray with an actual proper transfer that Roizman supervised himself, so it actually looked like the French Connection again. That's where I think we're at here, because this in no way, shape, or form really follows or acquiesces to what Willis signed off on the 2007 master. And there's a pretty easy way to tell. All you have to do is take the 2008 Blu-ray and compare the two, and you can see very clearly that they are not the same, and that this is a whole new different approach. And it goes back to what Robert Harris was saying, that this new version is in fact a new version. It is a new approach to presenting the Godfather films in 4K, but it's not how they originally were. And that's why he says it is this 4K master for all three films is not what he restored. And so while they used the work and the research of the 2007 restoration as their basis, because they had to, and they built upon that, and they were able to use more negative materials that they couldn't before, and they discovered additional things and various faults, it's on the other side of things where they've completely gone off on another path. So to borrow a phrase, this isn't your father's or your parents' Godfather, essentially now, in terms of the presentation. This is not an archival presentation of any of the three films. Things have been changed, they have been tweaked, they have been messed around with, and to such a degree that I think it's not just revisionism, but it's like sneaky and underhanded revisionism, because they've gone in and they've messed with things that most people are never going to notice. But if you have any sort of a trained eye, or you know anything about film presentation of catalog titles, or you know anything about the Godfather films, or you've ever handled prints, or you've seen prints, if you have any sort of experience, you should be able to tell that something is off somewhere, and it's not just the color. The color is what's discussed because Robert Harris talked about it publicly, and it's the most obvious difference you're going to notice. The other thing that really makes this a difficult argument is there was good work put into this, and I feel really badly for the people who dug through the vaults during COVID, and you can tell that the source scans, because it's a new scan, and they were able to use some more bits of negative that they couldn't do in 2007 because tools are better and they can access more things that were thought previously too far gone or too damaged. And they discovered more original materials that they didn't have in 2007 by doing more vault searches. If they had left this alone, if they had done it in the way that the 2007 restoration was handled, it would have been perfect. It would have been the 50th anniversary restoration that everybody could rave over. I'd be raving over it too. That's what I thought I was going into with this release. And from the opening frames, I just couldn't believe what I was seeing and what was going on. And it just kept going. And for the life of me, I can't understand why no one else is calling out Paramount on this. This is not an isolated incident, but this is the Godfather. They even admit the status of this being so important and being a great responsibility on their shoulders in the little restoration piece they made and included on this release. But apparently that's just all talk, because what has been done is really unforgivable. It's hard to find the right words, but it's just I don't know what they were thinking. I really don't. And This is not how these films should be seen. This is not how these films should be presented. And because of the higher quality, newer scan in 4K and being able to source some additional better materials, on the surface, it looks better than the older release. And the older release is a dated 2008 Blu-ray, and it is a bit noisy. And as Robert Harris admits, it's like a point too much in terms of the reds, in terms of the color timing. So the old 2008 Blu-rays are not perfect. But the problems there compared to this are minor. Because if you just compare the two, even on a 4K television, having to upscale the Coppola Restoration Blu-rays from 2008, yes, it's going to be, upscaling 1080p. Yes, they're going to look noisier, and they don't pop as much on a 4K television. And, it's obviously a 2008 encode on a Paramount Blu-ray versus a 2022 UHD. But just because something's old and is having to be upscaled and has issues of its own doesn't necessarily mean that it's not as good as what the newer release is. And if you have the ability to distance yourself from that for a second and to look a little bit more closely at the actual film in motion, not just pausing, but just take a moment for yourself, put on the UHD and also the 2008 Blu-rays, and just turn the sound off and just look at them in motion for a bit. And just start to look at it very closely and see which one feels more naturally to you, regardless of what your setup is. And this also goes for the 1080p Trilogy 50th anniversary set in SDR, because it has the same issues, just not quite as obvious because it's 1080p instead of 4K. But I think the 2008 Blu-rays are the far superior viewing experience for all three films, even though they're not 4K and they're outdated 2008 Blu-rays and they have issues of their own, because you don't have any of this modern tomfoolery going on, and you don't have the revisionist HDR application. You don't have the same amount of macroblocking and noise and everything. You don't have them playing around with the grain structure. You don't have the ridiculous and seemingly random DNR application, and you don't have the rampant frozen grain throughout. So there really is no upgrade in the modern version visually, at least from an archival and historical standpoint. And it's a damn shame, because this could have been perfect. It could have been great. And you can tell that underneath all the junk processing that has been done to these iconic films, that there was great life and detail and wonderful nuances in this scan had they left it alone and done it properly with an archival mindset, like what was done to the best of their ability in 2007. That's the key difference in these two restorations. So, I mean, it just astounds me that this is how the films have been treated. Now, if you were wondering if the SDR presentation on the Blu-ray release, which is sold separately in very similar packaging, would be any different, I had the same thought. So I went out and purchased the Blu-ray version separately, which I have here. Unfortunately, in SDR, while the problems are minimized, they are still there, and you still have the brightness from the HDR application in terms of the hard, very harsh and bright white lighting. It's still baked into this master, but because you're looking at it in SDR, it's not as glaringly overpowering, but it is still there. And because now it's much flatter, it stands out and it looks really bad. But you've still got the frozen grain. You've still got the noise and things. It's just in 1080p, it's not as obvious. What makes it worse, though, is that the 1080p Blu-ray versions are not well encoded at all. In fact, the encoding is pretty damn bad. And so you have the frozen grain, but it's now covered in additional noise, pixelization, and rampant macro blocking all over the place. Part 2 really suffers because you have such a long film crammed onto a single disc, and now we're talking about just a dual-layer Blu-ray instead of a UHD. So, unfortunately, the SDR presentation which again is only sold separately in this trilogy set of the Blu-rays only. It's got all the problems of the HDR on the presentation on the UHDs baked into this master, so you're not going to escape it. It does minimize some things, but it has problems of its own. So because of all of the rampant encoding problems and the macro blocking and the noise and the pixelization, in a lot of ways, it's actually worse. So this actually adds problems while dialing down the effects of some of the others. And of course, it's 1080p, which you're then having to upscale back to 4K, which I'm sure only enhances some of those issues and some of the and makes some of the macro blocking and things even worse than if you were just watching this in plain 1080p HD. Now, to briefly talk about the audio. All three films have the 5.1 mixes, which are remixes on 1 and 2, and essentially an upmix of the original Dolby Stereo SR on Part 3. These seem to be the same 5.1 remixes and tracks from the previous Blu-rays and other releases. However, the original mono audio tracks for Part 1 and Part 2 have never been properly restored. They were worked on a little bit in 2007 and presented as lossy mono on the old Blu-rays. While it's unfortunate they weren't lossless, those are the best sounding versions of either mono track that I've yet found, and they're better than any of the previous releases I've tried, even the various Laserdiscs and things. And of course, they weren't even on the DVDs the first go round. But it's really rather curious how the original mono tracks for 1 and 2 have been neglected once again. They're also lossy here on the new UHD and Blu-ray presentations. They have not been restored, but unfortunately, they haven't been left alone either. Part 2 sounds pretty much the same, so I do think they kind of left that one alone. So at least the audio on Part 2, you can listen to the lossy mono, and it at least sounds like it should, although it should be fully restored and lossless and an archival presentation. And the 5.1 remixes of both Godfather Part 1 and Part 2 should be thrown out the window because they're awful, and they are revisionist, and I can't stand them. Never could, even when I had the old DVDs, which admittedly I hardly ever watched because I hated the remixes so bad. So again, the mono on Part 2 is still lossy. It's pretty much the same as the old Blu-ray. It's the best we've had to date, but it's still not perfect, and it hasn't been given the royal treatment. But the audio on Part 1, it seems like they've tweaked it a little bit because it doesn't sound as good as the audio, the lossy mono track on the old Blu-ray. It is the same audio source, but it seems like it's been tweaked and slightly EQ'd a little bit differently. And it has 1 or 2 ticks in it as well. So it hasn't been fully restored and meticulously released in a beautiful archival lossless presentation either. So for all the talk about restoring the films, well, once again, here you have a high-profile film restoration that doesn't seem to give a crap about the original audio presentation, and that always really bugs me, because when you have iconic films, why are you going to neglect taking care of the sound mix, too? And why is all the preference going to be given to a remix? Isn't the point of a restoration to restore the film to as close to the original presentation as possible in both picture and sound? Apparently a lot of people don't think that, and I completely still do not understand that mentality. So the audio of both 1 and 2 still need an overhaul and a full proper restoration without messing around with things. So a proper archival lossless presentation of the original mono tracks for both Part 1 and Part 2 still has not yet been done. Now we turn to the packaging. So of course they first released a deluxe limited box set, which was absurdly overpriced, and really the only exclusive part was the coffee table book that the discs are presented in. The disc contents are the same as the standalone trilogy release. However, the discs in the coffee table anniversary swag box set are just tucked into slots in a page, so they're not properly protected like a lot of these oversized box sets where the last thing people care about is the discs themselves. And that release is really I didn't see the point to it, because you can get really great Godfather books already existing that are better than that sort of coffee table book they threw together for far less money. And of course, the standalone trilogy set has everything in an actual case for far less money, and the contents are the same. So this is the Godfather Trilogy UHD, new artwork, case, and packaging. The artwork is extraordinarily lackluster and not indicative of the Godfather really much at all, in my opinion. They, of course, have the iconic Puppet Master logo. It is embossed, and we do have the little J card advertising some of the extras, but then you take that off and the back is just plain. The actual material is really flimsy and very cheap. It literally moves around in the hand. It is so thin that it's very easy to damage, and when I got this brand new, it already had damage just in shipping and handling. It's got creasing in it already. It's just a very flimsy, thin package. It literally bends in the hand, and not the sort of quality you expect from a release of The Godfather. The cases have a sort of angle, and I think what their obvious inspiration was the original DVD box set, which had the hinged cases that were digipacks just like this. However, this was in the DVD heyday. I've had this since I was a teenager. It's still in perfect shape, and it's still a handsome, attractive, stylish box set package. This is still, I think, one of the best packaged releases of the Godfather films on home video. It does everything it needs to do. It has a slightly sort of faux leather feel to it, so while it looks very plain, it's actually much nicer when you actually get it in your hands. But it's very simplistic, and that works with the approach to packaging The Godfather. That's how a lot of the imagery has always been, going back to the original cover of the first edition of the novel, which, I have one here. So this is very much what they seem to have been going for with this, but this is just cheap across the board. On top of that, we get to the actual cases with the new sort of Photoshop collage for each film. Not very inspired. This is also used for all the menus of the disc, which are extraordinarily generic. And then you look on the back, each of them just has a tag quote from the film. And really generic font, no other imagery, just nothing. And you open to find another Photoshop photo collage, basic color tinting, very generic looking, plain generic disc label, nothing fancy or interesting at all. But on top of that, if that wasn't enough, the actual tray is already coming loose because it wasn't properly glued in there, if I can get this to focus. So if you see here in the corner, it's already loose, and you can also see that there's already some damage and wear on the actual case itself. Here, there's already a chip on the front of it. If you look, that's not a logo or a copyright trademark. That's actual damage already on this and creasing and things. And it's also very flimsy. It has a gloss finish to it, but it's a very cheap type of gloss. This reeks of feeling cheap. That's why I think a lot of people gravitated more towards the standalone steelbooks of the films with the same art. However, if you go that route, you don't get the bonus discs of the set, which do have the really important material and really is the only positive to this whole anniversary release on UHD. Another contrast, again, we have the under a year old 4K UHD digipack, which already has damage on the corners everywhere. It's got a crumpled corner on the front, and it just feels flimsy. Well, here is the 2001 DVD digipack. So this is 22 years old, no damage, no creasing, no feeling of cheapness. It uses the static singular image for each of these. But it fits the design of the set. It's very simple. It's no frills, but it has the feeling of quality and significance to it for being The Godfather. That's what you get from this. And the back is just plain black, but it has the cast and crew listing, but it's in the same matching sort of bronze color, the copper color as the rest of the set. So everything feels unified. It's also on the labels as well. And of course, the DVD era was the heyday of home video, and we're probably never going to see that level of care and volume of releases and money in the industry again, which is understandable. But it definitely says something when a 22-year-old DVD package feels superior to the brand new UHD package that is patterned after its design. So here we have the Digipack 4 Part 2. Again, rather generic looking artwork. I don't know how well you'll be able to see this, but on this particular digipack, it's already sort of smushed, so it doesn't actually close flat. If you look, the actual front cover is shifted up slightly because it's been smushed and creased that way. So already this has that type of damage to it. The back has additional marks on it. Again, those are not stylistic marks. Those are actually chips in the artwork. And then the corners have creasing and crumpling as well. So again, these are so cheaply made that they are already damaged when you get them brand new and you take them out of the box. The artwork here looks even more generic because there's just a slight, lightly tinged blue filter applied to everything. So it looks like they just grabbed a bunch of images and stitched them together. It just does not feel worthy of it being a Godfather release. And again, plain generic disc label from Paramount. Here is the digipack for the new Coda cut of Part 3. Same artwork used for the standalone Blu-ray. Again, some of the same problems. This one, you can see on the back, the whole side is already crumpled inwards, so the edge is crumpled there. The front corner is crumpled as well. A lot of this will happen when you take these in and out of the set because it's not cut very well, and you do have to be very careful because just normal wear and tear is going to happen because these are so cheap and flimsy, and the way that you have to angle them in and out. Same sort of thing, very generic sort of photo collage here, tinged red, so at least it is a bit more attention grabbing. And again, plain generic Paramount disc label. The rear with the "pull me back in" quote. Again, this one looks a little bit better because it's red, but it still just reeks of somebody threw this together real quick. And now we come to the bonus disc. This is the trilogy set exclusive material, and this is why if you're going to purchase any version of this new master or release, any of the releases, it should be the trilogy set, because you don't get either of these discs in the standalone versions. So we just have a simple, generic-looking bonus disc case. Again, a digipack with the artwork repeated from the actual cover, so the sort of blood red rose, which still does not really scream Godfather to me when I look at it, but you know, that's what they went with. Again, this does already have some creasing of the corners and does feel very flimsy. Here we just have the image collage broken up by a black spine. Again, it's in red, so it looks better than the stuff on Part 1 and Part 2. But we do have two discs here. The bonus disc is all of the legacy extras, and the 3 new extras are on a standard 1080p Blu-ray. The additional disc in here is a UHD, and this is the other important part of getting the trilogy set itself. This is an additional UHD of The Godfather Part III, and this includes both the 1991 home video cut of the film, which is the longest version and the version we've had on video all these years up until Coda, which is the shortest version. But it also gives us, for the first time ever on home video, the original theatrical release version, which is about 9 minutes shorter than the extended director's video cut. So this is basically an archival versions disc with the other 2 versions of Part 3, and we finally get the theatrical cut on disc. So you can do the comparisons between the 3 cuts, which are rather fascinating from an editing perspective. I myself still think the video director's cut, the longest version, is the best version of the film. That's just my own opinion, but I think it has additional moments that are really necessary, and I miss not being in the other cuts. And particularly, my big problem with the new Coda cut is it does try to cut down the runtime, which is fine to make a faster, more technically effective film. But I think the things they chose to remove are mistakes. Particularly, I always felt Eli Wallach was not utilized nearly enough in the film, and the biggest mistake of the new Coda version is the good majority of his handful of scenes in Part 3 are now either removed entirely or severely trimmed down. And any loss of Eli Wallach footage in Part 3 is a mistake because he's barely in it, and that was already one of the biggest problems because he's just about the best thing in the film when he's actually in it. So that's why I'm very happy that Coppola has not done like some of his contemporaries, and when he makes a new cut of one of his films, he does not let it supplant and replace the original cuts, and that's why it's even more important that the original theatrical release version has now finally seen disc, but only as the bonus UHD in the trilogy set. So if you're going to purchase any of the new releases, you do have to go ahead and get the trilogy set because of the important bonus material in terms of having all the cuts of Part 3, most of all. Another note about the packaging is that while the UHD trilogy set is really cheap and flimsy, the equivalent Blu-ray package, even though it's simpler, actually I think is a much better packaging option. It's the same basic artwork, still has embossing and a J card. It's a slip box, but has a standard Blu-ray case inside. Similar matching artwork, very plain, very simple. This is how most sets are going to be done. And of course, the Blu-rays just have a standard blue label. And you still get that same 1080p bonus disc. So the actual layout, much simpler, but to be honest, since the UHD set is so cheap and flimsy, I would have been perfectly fine with just a standard case for the UHD set. And this really should have been dual format. I'm not big on studios splitting things up like this, and for a full set, Paramount has done sets that are dual format with both the UHDs and the Blu-rays, the Mission Impossible box sets, for example. And to be honest, I would have been perfectly fine with just a standard case and slip box like the Blu-ray set for the UHD set. So ironically, even though it's simpler, I think the Blu-ray set's actually a better package, and this was even cheaper to manufacture. So I'd rather it be a simple case that actually works than something where it's trying to act like a premium release, but they're not really trying, because again, this is very much patterned on the 2001 DVD original set, and it's not as good, quite frankly. So that, again, I think the Blu-ray is actually a simpler and better package. Now, to move on to the special features, and I don't consider the alternate cuts of Godfather Part III special features, because really, I do think the video director's cut is the best version of the film, and I don't think it's a special feature to include the other versions of the film in addition to the new cut. That should really not be locked away as an exclusive bonus. I think it's really not proper to sell Coda, even though it's the new cut and the cut that Coppola prefers. It shouldn't be sold separately and sold as and promoted on streaming services and in packages as the premiere and only version of the film, which is how it's sold as a standalone. Again, the other cuts of Godfather Part III are exclusive to the trilogy box set. So if you buy the standalones or any other version of the Godfather films, you're going to be getting the new Coda cut of Part 3 and not the other cuts of the film. I think all three cuts of the film should be presented in all releases of Godfather Part 3. So the actual extras on this set are actually all here on the J card. As it says, it has all new special features, and then it lists a whole bunch of other things. It's a little bit deceptive because, to be quite honest, there really only are a handful of new extras. So the enticements to purchase the new release, if you've purchased a lot of different ones over the years, it's not that much here. We have new introductions by where Coppola does a brief introduction for all three films. Those are on the film disc, so we get one of those little brief intro bits where you could watch that before you watch the film. I don't know if I necessarily count those as new extras because they are very brief. They're they are what they are, and those things are always nice. But it's, if you're a fan of the films, it's just, it doesn't really add a whole lot. It's just a very short, brief introduction for each film. Then we have some restoration comparisons, which is primarily done in their new piece on the 50th anniversary master, which is, it really, I can't stand watching it because it gets me yelling at the screen because they seem so pleased with the work that they've done, and they even have their side-by-side comparisons where you can clearly see that the older master, while it is an older master, is much more appropriate actually in every comparison and instance they reference. It goes into some detail, and you can understand the workflow they were going through, and it makes me feel bad for the people who did all the hard work on the front end, that this is what resulted. And they have people from Zoetrope talking, and so it's again, it makes it really difficult to try and figure out how this stuff happened, because you have Zoetrope, you have the colorist at MPI, and then you have Paramount. And so who did what and how exactly this came to be, they sort of address a little bit, but it very much seems to be, you know, Paramount had the final sort of pass on everything, and all this stuff has the earmarks of the modern Paramount catalog release in terms of all the issues we keep seeing turn up on countless ruined masters and physical media releases from Paramount. So that's my strongest suspicion, that this is all Paramount's doing. But again, don't know, that's just my educated guess. But you can watch that, and if you're like me, very much appalled at what you're seeing in the UHD presentations, you're going to be gritting your teeth a lot. And they also go into some additional details as well, which I don't necessarily agree with. There's another, the only other quibble that Robert Harris mentioned in his review is, now, there's a particular portion of The Godfather where, when they go to Vegas for the first time, it's one of the short sequences where they did use stock footage originally. And so the footage of all the signs of the classic Vegas casinos in the 50s is stock footage from another film. That was duped in, so it was, you know, not from the original source to begin with, and that was done to also sort of match it with the rest of the film, because the film it was sourced from was actually shot in VistaVision, which is a much higher visual quality because of it being VistaVision and it being film running horizontally through the camera at a much more vivid resolution than how The Godfather was shot in a standard format. So to do what they did on this new restoration, as they claim it is, and go in and source that original VistaVision footage, which they do show a side-by-side comparison in this little documentary of theirs, this little featurette, means that simply putting that in there makes it stick out like a sore thumb, because it looks so much technically sharper and more vivid than anything in the rest of the film, because you just essentially slugged in a direct copy of some VistaVision footage. So now that little bit of stock footage in The Godfather Part 1 doesn't mesh with the rest of that sequence and the rest of the film, because they literally just took that from the original VistaVision element, and that sticks out like a sore thumb. And I think you could notice that even if you don't know anything about film formats or where that particular piece came from. But they do highlight it here, and they show the comparison. And you can clearly see, even in their comparison, that the VistaVision footage they directly sourced just doesn't match, because it's so much more of a higher quality standard, because it's coming from a large format film process in VistaVision. That was the only other technical thing that Robert Harris ever mentioned, besides his issues with the approach to the color timing. So you can actually see that highlighted here in their little piece. So again, if you're like me and you have major problems with this master, this documentary featurette is really going to make you grit your teeth and yell at the screen. Then the only other real features, I mean, technically, I would only count this release as having 3 new features, because again, I'm not really counting the Coppola introductions, because they're very short and they're on the film disc. So in terms of what's on the new bonus features disc, that is actual new bonus material newly generated for this release, we have the featurette I just went over. Then we have a really fascinating piece entitled Capturing the Corleones Through the Lens of Photographer Steve Shapiro. This is Steve Shapiro, who was the on-set photographer for various magazines, going through his own photo archive of his time on the first film in particular, and talking about his own approach to doing set photography and trying to essentially get that fly-on-the-wall perspective of the actors and crew during the making of the film, and not ever become noticed, but also get the little bits of downtime and the small moments. And there are scans of his photos, some used, some, I guess, never before seen, from his own personal archives. And it's a really nice piece. I think it runs about 14-15 minutes, and it's filled with great imagery. It's a wonderful extra. I really enjoyed that. Then we get a wonderful very short but very candid bit of actual home movies, and that's what it's literally labeled as. But this is, it seems like probably 8mm footage of primarily it's based around the shooting of the wedding sequence in part 1, but it's actual on-set 8mm handheld silent footage of the actors and crew and everybody during the making of part 1. And the best bits are when you see the actors all goofing around, and it's priceless footage. It is silent because it was, it's pretty much handheld 8mm, so of course it's silent, but it is actually in color, and this is priceless footage. So it runs about, I think it runs about 8 minutes or so. But it's absolutely priceless, and it's that pure time capsule of you are there. And, if you look closely enough, you can catch a few glimpses of Coppola looking absolutely miserable, because it was a miserable shoot, particularly for him, most of all. So if you've ever read a lot about the making of The Godfather, which there are plenty of great books out there, a plethora of great material out there, this perfectly jibes with maybe your mental picture of picturing how the shoot went, or if you've watched the old documentaries talking about the production being so hectic and things, and finding little bits of fun to inject in there to sort of break up the tension. Well, you get that here in visual form finally. So that's a wonderful, priceless little treasure. And that's it. That's it for the new extras. Everything else listed here and everything they discuss and go into is everything that was on the previous releases. So this does carry over the extras generated for the 2008 Blu-rays and DVDs in the Coppola restoration, and the stuff originating to the 2001 DVD set, and which was also built around primarily the documentary Godfather Family, which actually was done back in 1991 for the Laserdisc box set, which of course I have here. So this was the collector's edition Laserdisc box set, which just took the standalone open-matted 133 transfers of the Laserdisc releases of the films, put them in a box set here with a fancier package, and included the Godfather Family A Look Inside documentary, which is a little bit over an hour. I think it's about 75 minutes, so it is technically feature length, and it was done during the making of Godfather Part III, and does have a lot of cast and crew and actors talking about the film. So it is still the best overall documentary on the making of the Godfather films, although there really could be a more comprehensive one done now, but there's also a lot of great vintage footage that you just don't see anywhere else, so it's great that's been carried over. But it's never been upgraded to HD, so it's still dated to this old standard def version, and I think they shot most of this on film anyway for the interviews, but it originated on the Laserdisc release. So again, the only new extras you really have, if you don't count the introductions, is you really just have 3 short pieces, and this is for The Godfather's 50th anniversary. That's frankly not really enough for The Godfather hitting the 50th anniversary milestone and doing a big rollout and a new master and all this work and stuff. So that also, in addition to the rather cheap and flimsy packaging, just doesn't... Yeah, I mean, there are so many genre films getting releases nowadays that have far more extras, so that means they're relying almost entirely on all the legacy extras, which were well done and are still very good, and you still get tons of material to go through, whether you've seen them before or not. But this means, in terms of the new extras as a draw for fans and collectors to pick up the new releases, you're really just looking at these 3 featurette pieces. That when you add all 3 of them up, you're still looking at well under 45 minutes. So that still doesn't feel quite right for something as legendary as The Godfather at this particular anniversary milestone. So when you go and you look at the legacy extras, unfortunately, not only have they not been upgraded and they're not in high definition, they even actually, they when you go to, in particular, the extras from the 2001 DVD set, when you access those, it actually reutilizes and recreates the original DVD menu right down to the same selections. So when you click on those on the UHD, well, it's the Blu-ray in the UHD set, it's actually the 2001 DVD menu. So it's literally the same. except it's having to upscale and everything. So it looks far worse now than it's done in the years past, because now we're in 4K land. But this is how you still have to access all the vintage materials, all of the Godfather family documentary. All the deleted scenes are still this way, which still means they are M133. They're standard def. They don't look very good. They don't sound very good. And the fact that the deleted scenes and all of the massive amount of screen tests and alternate footage and work footage and things that we get glimpses of in the documentaries and things, but have never seen all of, the fact that these have not been scanned in HD anywhere and they haven't been improved on or worked on since 2001 when they were just copied over for the DVD set, that's really bad. I mean, I would think at the very least we could get a new scan of the deleted scenes. And this isn't even going into the fact that the various chronological cuts of The Godfather have never been fully restored or released outside of the Laserdisc box set and the VHS release of the early 90s chronological cut. There are now several chronological cuts. And if that wasn't bad enough, if they wanted to make the claim, oh, well, we've never upgraded that stuff, that's not true either, because a couple years ago for streaming, I believe it was for HBO Max, there was a new version of the Godfather Saga chronological cut made and exhibited and shown in HD. So that means there are HD transfers of a lot of this deleted footage and material out there that had to be done to recreate the chronological cut that utilized a lot of that deleted material to put in there, because originally it was done for network television and spread out over multiple broadcasts and needed the longer runtime, also to cover up the edits done to be approved by the television censors. So it helped to cover up all the gaps for the runtime to be filled out with a lot of deleted footage. So that's a real missed opportunity. And if they wanted to make this a big anniversary thing and they wanted to get the fans excited, they could have made a disc release of at least that streaming version of the Godfather Saga, because there are a lot of fans who like the chronological cuts and they have to keep their VCRs and their Laserdisc players going. Or, since they were already recutting Godfather Part III, they could have done a full brand new chronological edit in HD, for the most deluxe box set version or something, and really made something for the fans that was different and special. That would have kind of made sense for a 50th anniversary release, I would think. But, and I don't think anybody wanted to put that much work into this, to be quite honest. And this is just me spitballing various ideas, because I'm very, very perplexed and kind of scratching my head a bit that, really all you're getting are 3 new extras. And it was really crazy to see that clicking on the old extras from the 2001 DVD set literally pull up the 2001 bonus DVD disc menu. I mean, it's literally a recreation of the 2001 bonus disc. That was really bizarre to see on a Blu-ray like that in this new UHD set. So that and the 2007 extras are carried over, but they're all primarily standard def as well, and they don't look too nice, upscaled all the way up to 4K either. So do keep that in mind, that looking at all the wonderful and important other legacy extras, you're going to have to deal with the fact that they're basically ported over from the 2001 and 2007 discs without any spiffing up or extra treatment or trying to make them look any better at all. They're literally just ported over as is. So in short, those are my thoughts on the new 50th anniversary master and release of the Godfather Trilogy on both 4K UHD with Dolby Vision and on Blu-ray in standard dynamic range from Paramount. As I said before, this is really representative, I think, of a new era in how catalog films can be manipulated. I think in a couple years, a lot more people are going to be better acquainted with things like this, because this is not something that's going to go away, and this is something that Paramount is continually doing on a lot of their catalog titles to varying degrees. But here, it's really damaging, because it's The Godfather, and the Godfather films are so famous for their visual stylings, and here what has been done really was totally unnecessary. And you can see, again, the strength of the scan that was done and the work that was put in on the front end. And had everything been done in the workflow by all parties, because again, I don't know exactly who or what entity mandated these things be done. I can only make guesses. But had the entire workflow been done with the archival mindset of the 2007 restoration, we wouldn't be discussing this. I wouldn't be discussing this. And I would be singing the praises of this release like every other major review out there. And that's another reason why I've gone into much more detail than I normally would. Not only was I appalled at this presentation, and I think this is an insult to the original films, fans of the films, the people who put blood, sweat, and tears to make these iconic masterworks of cinema, but just an insult to the film's legacy, actually, and that's me putting it as politely as I possibly can. I think this is not the way you should see these films, and you should just stick with the 2008 Blu-rays, even though those are getting on up there in years. At least they do not have the incredible revisionism and terrible issues of this new 50th anniversary master, which I think is really unforgivable. And to be quite honest, I would challenge anyone from Paramount to explain why they thought any of this tomfoolery was a good idea or acceptable in any way, shape, or form, particularly in regards to The Godfather, which is one of the crown jewels of the Paramount library and, one of the most famous films ever made. You would think that, if you were going to not mess around with any film, that you might not mess around with The Godfather, but apparently, I guess it was decided it was, open season and people could just do what they wanted, apparently. So, again, if anyone has some sort of rationale for presenting the Godfather films in this way, with this type of revisionism and HDR revisionism and frozen grain and noise throughout and not respecting the original soundtracks in terms of properly restoring the original mono tracks for 1 and 2 and a proper archival presentation and respecting the intent of the original production, and I would like to hear the reasons or thoughts or rationale behind this, if it could be made, because you really can't. I don't think make an argument why there should be frozen grain throughout The Godfather on 4K UHD in Dolby Vision. And if you were to maybe ask, well, what is an example of a catalog title from the same era done right with a Dolby Vision grade? That's a brand new release, or release from the same year in terms of 2022-2023, where the HDR is done tastefully and appropriately. The mastering is well done. The original audio is given the proper respect it deserves and is in the best quality we have access to in a lossless codec, and there are a wonderful wealth of new extras and lovely, wonderful packaging that is also affordable. Well, I do have an answer for you. The complete antithesis of the Godfather Trilogy on 4K UHD. The release that shows just how badly managed the Godfather Trilogy has been, and has been just completely torn apart, is the BFI's release of Get Carter on 4K UHD. Get Carter was from 1971. It is a British film which did not have the biggest budget in the world, was not exhibited hardly at all in the United States, and has been kicked around for decades. The original elements were not in the greatest of shape. It took several different attempts to piece the film back together, pretty much originally in the 1990s, and also restore the original British soundtrack of the film, which had been replaced by the Americanized, partially dubbed version. And so finally, the BFI, in cooperation with Warner Brothers, for this 2022 4K UHD release for the film's anniversary, managed to scan the original negative, do a brand new 4K master with HDR and Dolby Vision grading, present the original mono track and the best quality that we've had access to from the restored elements of the British sound mix in lossless mono, with a brand new extras package, which is quite substantial, far more than the 3 measly extras we get for the Godfather trilogy in its entirety. But it comes in a wonderful limited edition package with brand new custom artwork, with art postcards, with a whole supplemental features Blu-ray, with a hardbound 75-page booklet loaded with stills and essays and vintage pieces and interviews. Just the wonderful type of book that you expect from a release like this. And if that wasn't enough, a fold-out poster with the new poster image for the film's UK theatrical anniversary re-release in 4K, double-sided with the original UK iconic quad poster artwork. And it still looks great when you take the J card off. There is absolutely no reason the Godfather trilogy could not have at least some of the same quality treatment that Get Carter received. This is a film from the same era, made just the year before the original Godfather film, where the elements were not in pristine shape. They, of course, were nowhere near as damaged, particularly as The Godfather Part I, which was reprinted and torn apart to death. But it is of a similar vintage. It was a very low-budget production. It wasn't the most, it definitely wasn't the most expensive film in the world. It has an iconic grunginess to its look. But this transfer is absolutely immaculate, to the point of feeling almost more hands-off and totally archival. There is absolutely zero color issue. There are no problems with the HDR grading in Dolby Vision. Absolutely no HDR revisionism, color revisionism, no issues with grain whatsoever, zero signs of any frozen grain, pixelization, noise, artifacts, and it has a wonderful encode for the disc in both the 4K UHD and HDR, and I also reviewed the 1080p Blu-ray version in SDR. I did do a full review if you're interested in more information on this release. I simply thought this would be a great comparison because I suddenly realized, Get Carter was made the year before The Godfather, and this is the sort of perfect dream release treatment it has finally received after being really treated quite poorly on home video for years. It didn't even really have a video release until the early to mid-1990s on VHS. That's how long it took to get a video release officially in either the US or the UK. So this is the perfect example. This is the exact opposite of how the Godfather films were treated. This is how the Godfather trilogy should look and sound on UHD in a 4K master, whether you're looking at the SDR Blu-ray or the 4K UHD. They should be presented with an archival mindset like Get Carter was from the BFI. So this is a perfect example of a catalog title done perfectly on 4K and for UHD with HDR grading and Dolby Vision. The exact thing that the Godfather trilogy release is not. I really hate to sound so negative, but I really feel this release calls for it. I again think that the treatment of the Godfather trilogy here is appalling, and even though it's more on the sneaky and underhanded side, this is stuff that they're doing with the Godfather. I mean, that's really unfathomable. It makes me think very much of some of the really notorious releases in home video history, especially, there's another Paramount title that springs to mind, which got rave reviews back when it came out, and then people quickly realized once DVD got more and more underway how bad it was. And that was Paramount's first release of Sunset Boulevard on DVD, which was a hideous Lowry Digital nightmare of a master. The film was DNR'd to hell and back, and is so bad that it has the appearance of the grayscale dipping more into the sort of greenish and very contrasty territory. It is absolutely one of the worst DVDs ever made and one of the worst home video releases of all time from a transfer standpoint. And thankfully, it was finally corrected by newer masters being made, but that took a long while. But that's the type of Paramount release this makes me think of, and it really, because it's so kind of sneaky and underhanded, I in terms of what's been done here with the Godfather films and this new 4K master. That's why I think a lot of people haven't picked up on it, because you do kind of have to pay attention a little bit. And I can understand the average consumer or the average viewer or the average film fan not noticing this stuff and wondering what I'm talking about. Again, that's why I tried to go into more detail than I normally would, and I dispensed entirely with my normal sort of opening remarks about the films, which I like doing. But the fact that no official review commented on any of these problems, and the only discussion was on the color timing revisionism, simply, really due to Robert Harris starting the discussion over on Home Theater Forum, that really bothers me. And this is something that I think every official review should have caught. If you are going to review disc releases, these are things you need to know about and things that you need to be able to spot. And I can understand people not seeing it as much in Godfather Part 2 because it is lessened and it is harder to spot, but it is still there and it is visible. But to not comment on the frozen grain in The Godfather alone, that I find mind-boggling. So again, I think I don't know how anyone gave this a positive review. It is not the way these films should be seen and presented, and it's very deceptive. And I think it's very deceptive to the average consumer and viewer as well, who will be presented with this new version, which is really a new master that takes completely different approaches and kind of takes it upon itself to change things and mess about with stuff that, 10 or 20 years ago, they wouldn't have been able to do, or to this degree. And because it is on the sneaky and underhanded side, most people are going to have no idea this stuff has happened, because they're not going to have the background or the knowledge or be able to spot these things. And if they maybe think something is a little bit off or weird compared to the older releases, they'll see the little restoration documentary piece and think, oh yeah, they did all this work and it's great and blah, 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 because they put it in this whole package of, we did all this great work and, we've saved the film again and it looks better than it ever has before. And it's like, well, no, no, it doesn't. And for me, I don't think I'm ever going to watch the new master ever again, because the frozen grain alone is appalling, and that in and of itself should have earned this a complete negative review from every reviewer. So I don't understand how this got a positive review from anyone, and I think people need to take a closer look at this release and this presentation, and also start thinking about, once again, what 4K and HDR means for the potential to have revisionism in regards to catalog titles, because it's a very, very fine line that you have to walk in bringing catalog titles to this new format, to make them as good as humanly possible without ever detracting or manipulating or somehow changing in any way, shape, or form the aspects of the original presentation in both picture and sound. And unfortunately, the vast majority of the time, that's not something on people's minds, especially in terms of major studios doing major releases. And a lot of people will claim that only a boutique label can put in that time of care and effort to further manage a transfer process, which is an argument that could be substantiated in some ways. But when you get to particularly big, major crown jewel catalog titles, particularly the Godfather films of all things, and this is how you treat them, I simply don't understand why this was done and why this is how these films are now stuck. And unfortunately, particularly due to the rave reviews this set received across the board, they're going to be stuck this way for a long time. And again, I completely question any rave review that this set got, because it does not deserve anything but scorn. I absolutely wholeheartedly encourage people to just go with the original Blu-ray release, the 2007 master on the 2008 Blu-rays. Yes, they're old. Yes, they're going to look really noisy when you upscale them to 4K. Yes, they have the different approach to the color timing, which is actually trying to be as archivally minded as humanly possible, and that is the version that was signed off on by the film's original cinematographer, which the new master was not and does not follow. So in spite of them being older and imperfect and not the best they technically could be now, especially in 2023, the original 2008 Blu-rays are the far superior experience for all three films, and they are giving you a proper presentation of all three films, which the new releases do not, in spite of what they claim. I am trying to stress this as much as humanly possible, because it is rare for a release to get me this infuriated and beside myself. I had to really think long and hard about how to try and put all of this into words. I know not everyone is going to agree with me, because a lot of people seem perfectly fine with this release. But again, I encourage people to take a closer look at this. Look at this on your old setups, compare it to the older releases, do some digging online, do some reading around, and just make up your own minds. But I really cannot understand why anyone involved in this process thought that any of these things that were done to the Godfather films were a good idea at any time, because they are not, and this so-called restoration is absolutely appalling. Again, I hate to sound this negative, but these are my honest thoughts. It is that bad in terms of the situation with how the Godfather films are now stuck in this new, quite frankly, ungodly 4K master, which is just absolutely unfathomable that these films have now been subjected to this level of revisionism and tomfoolery. However, I did want to end on a positive note. There is one positive to the 50th anniversary celebration of the Godfather films. There is one element that actually took the time and the care and gave the respect to the work that is deserved for dealing with the Godfather films. And that is actually the soundtrack reissue from La La Land Records. This is the 2 CD complete score of the film, finally getting an expanded score release. So this is Nino Rota's iconic original score in this beautifully restored 2 CD expanded and complete presentation from La La Land Records, doing their usual beyond exemplary job. They involved many of the great soundtrack experts, particularly Chris Malone, who spearheaded the restoration work, and you see his name involved in any soundtrack release, and it's just immediately plunk your money down, because it is worth its weight in gold. This is a soundtrack release. I think myself and many other people had sort of given up hope would ever happen, that there would be even an expanded Godfather score release. We just had the same CD, which is basically, a copy of the old LP master program for years and years and years. No expansions, no score box set for any of the Godfather scores. This is a very simple but beautifully done release, like all La La Land releases. It is, because it's a specialty soundtrack label and it is limited, it is a little on the pricier side as compared to your standard mass market CD. But this is where you should spend your hard-earned money. This is the one thing in regards to working on The Godfather and restoring anything for the 50th anniversary that was done with care, quality, and respect. This is the only great thing to come out of the 50th anniversary. This is the one must-own release for all Godfather fans, in my opinion, is the beautiful La La Land Records 2 CD limited edition reissue of Nino Rota's iconic musical score for the film. And it goes across 2 discs, including additional cues, the entire original soundtrack program, and additional source music and additional music-only pieces. So it totals in at just under 2 hours for the entire program and bonus tracks for both CDs. This is so completely worth the purchase price. It's a no-brainer, and it is the one must-own new release for all Godfather fans. I will leave a link in the description below. Again, this is the one great positive thing to come out of the film's 50th anniversary. So please do yourself a favor, get a copy of this, and to be quite frank, just ignore the new 4K master, in my opinion, at least. I know not everyone is going to agree, but I did want to end on a positive note, and this new reissue of the score is one I simply thought would never happen, and it has been done beautifully. This is the type of quality that I expect it to get in the new UHD trilogy set, and simply is not there at all. So these have been my thoughts on the new 50th anniversary master of the Godfather trilogy, and I think the horrible revisionism and processing that has been done to the films that really destroys any positives of the new work that has been done. I think this is an appalling treatment of the films. I don't think this is something that should be supported. I really think that Paramount in particular needs to be called out on this terrible work they keep doing on the vast majority of their catalog titles and their so-called restorations. But this one really stings because it's the Godfather of all films. And the way this has been sold is some sort of great restoration work and all the praise this has received. It really bothers me terribly because it gives restoration a bad name, it gives physical media a bad name, and it's really an insult to the films and the legacy of the films, the iconic status of the films. And, if this is how you're going to treat the Godfather of all films, what does that mean for the rest of the catalog? And it seems Paramount's hell-bent on proving that, unfortunately, with all their myriad of terrible problems in their various releases and, again, so-called restorations. So I hate to be so negative, but I think this calls for it. And again, this is merely my own opinion. I have tried to do as much research as I could, but it hasn't been very easy because there isn't really much out there about potential issues with this new master, except for discussing the color timing. And I have had some discussions with some various people I know in different forums, and I have asked around, and I have talked to various film people I know in different parts of industries and even in the editing world and different things. So people who know more about film and film handling and presentations and in the technical terms can understand what I'm talking about, and they know what I'm talking about in terms of the Godfather release. But the vast positivity from all the official physical media reviews is really unsettling, because this release does not deserve any of that, because the problems here, while they're not as obvious as a lot of really so-called very labeled problem discs, the issues here are really bad. And I think Robert Harris was trying to be polite and watch what he was saying in terms of not wanting to go into any details. And to be quite honest, I wish he would go into details, because somebody else needs to, because there are unbelievable issues on display here, and they are painfully obvious when you know what this stuff can manifest itself as. So I do encourage people to go and take a closer look if you've got the UHD or the new Blu-rays, and especially if you can compare it to the older, very inexpensive now 2008 Blu-rays, which I think are the far better option across the board for all three films. So again, my bottom line is I would just tell anyone to just stick with the 2008 Blu-rays, even though they are getting on up there in years and they themselves are not perfect. I think they are still far unbelievably better than the UHD releases, which again, in spite of them being a newer scan and scans that could have been perfectly executed in a new 4K master, I will most likely never watch these presentations again because they are that unbelievably bad. So, again, this is merely my own opinion. You may not agree with me, so if you want to continue the discussion below, I'm always happy to hear people's thoughts in the comments. And I do want to encourage people to look more closely at disc releases and new transfers and things, because you don't have to be a quote-unquote expert in these things to want to learn more or figure out how things are made or done, or be able to identify things that maybe you just couldn't quite put your finger on because you didn't know what it was that you were looking at. You know, there's no official checklist or credibility check. There's no test you have to pass to be able to review physical media releases or disc releases. But the way I look at it is, if you're going to do that, you should darn well sure to at least try to know what you're talking about and put the time in and do research and do comparisons to past releases and research the film's history, and don't just look at what's on the surface and claim that it's great because everybody else says that it's great and it's a new restoration, and the little piece and all the sales and the ad copy for the new release is about this new breathtaking revelatory restoration, because that's not always the case of what is going on. And here, I think, is a really probably the prime example, because this again, I think, is unfortunately going to be a sort of poster child for where we're going to move forward in the 4K and HDR realm, with catalog titles being able to be manipulated to a degree that we've never seen before. So I really hope this trend does not continue, but unfortunately, given the past histories of formats in home video and how we still deal with revisionism problems in picture and sound to this day, it's not something that's ever gone away. It's not going to go away. It's only going to get worse with the bigger toy box that people have, essentially. And I think this is a prime example of that. It's just not as on the surface, so not as many people spot it right off the bat. It is very sneaky and underhanded in a lot of ways. And I think underhanded is a very good way to describe this. And it's been a long time since a release or master has gotten me this infuriated and angry and appalled at the treatment, especially for iconic masterpieces of the cinema. So again, this has just been my thoughts on the new 4K master of the Godfather Trilogy, which I encourage people to research, dig into, and examine for themselves, and be sure and have a copy of the 2008 Blu-rays as well under the Coppola Restoration banner, because that is the last preserved version of how the films should at least appear on home video, even if they are not 100% perfect themselves. So as always, I do hope this has been at least somewhat informative, maybe somewhat fun. I don't know, because this was, unfortunately, I had to go completely negative, but I really had to say something. I couldn't just sit on this, and I know I'm like just about the only person who's saying this release is terrible, but it really is, and Paramount needs to be called out on this. They're doing this with a lot of releases, but this is The Godfather. I mean, come on. So make of that what you will, I guess. Again, if you have any thoughts or if you disagree with me, that is perfectly fine. I would love to continue this discussion in the comments below. Again, this is not my sort of typical disc review. I will go back to doing that for all of my other reviews as I normally do, but this is a special case, and unfortunately, I think this is where we're moving into this new territory of new levels of revisionism, and this is going to be a sign of problems we're going to face on probably to even greater degrees as time moves forward with the UHD format, in particular with catalog titles. But of course, I'm just some guy on the internet who puts way too much time and energy into doing disc reviews and film analysis and film research, even in my daily life outside of making videos. So, I'm not some Pesanavante holding the strings, unfortunately, because if I were, I would have made darn sure that this master was done correctly and with an archival mindset. But unfortunately, it didn't turn out this way this time, and this is the situation we look at with the Godfather films as of right now in 2023. But there's always that last little ray of hope, that last little bit of positivity that maybe someday with a proper, once again, archival restoration, with a full archival mindset like the 2007 restoration, that maybe with the next release of the Godfather films, that just maybe we'll get there. We'll get there, Pop. And thank you ever so much for watching.